Hello, my friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, I'm going to do a, presentation on quality risk management, and this relates to the ICHQ-9. I should have put ICHQ-9R1 because this is the revised version from January 2023. I'm not going to go through absolutely everything on there because it will take me a long time, and I'm going to give my understanding and my interpretation of this particular guideline. So, ICHQ-9, Quality Risk Management. What is it for? Why should we do it? And when should we do it? And I think that's quite an important question to ask because it's not actually something that is legislated or something that is, requires any regulatory submission. But it is something that is important for the protection of patients, and that's ultimately what we're interested in within the pharmaceutical industry. So I just want to talk about the differences in the first instance between risk-based approach and risk management, and what the differences are, because in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry we're already taking a risk-based approach in many of our regulatory submissions, in many of our quality management systems. We're already doing that. We're already taking a risk-based approach, and I just really want to talk about and identify where the differences are and where and how they're linked. Because a risk-based approach is where a risk assessment, I'm sorry, that has risk analysis. What I really mean is a risk assessment has already identified and controlled for potential harm and risk. So you've already identified and controlled for where there are risks, and you've taken those into considerations, and you're now taking a risk-based approach. And examples of risk-based approach are what I've got there. So for example, a healthcare professional prescribing one medication over another, you know, they are taking into consideration the patient, their specific profile, their disease state, and the progression of the disease or the stage of the disease, and the potential for adverse reactions in that particular patient versus, say, for example, the potentials and the potential benefits. And the potential benefits may very well be life altering or life changing or life savings. So the benefits may outweigh the risks. And so therefore that patient is prescribed a particular medication over another. And another example there is regarding manufacturing processes. Whenever we develop a manufacturing process or make changes to a manufacturing process, we do risk analysis or risk assessments, risk assessments. And those risk assessments will allow us to make a risk-based approach, to take a risk-based approach to what we're going to now do from this point onwards. So for example, if we change our manufacturing process, we will identify what the risks are associated with changing this manufacturing process are. We will do an analysis where we will generate data, and we will compare those data to some kind of criteria to show that it is either good to take that risk and to do those changes or not. Or there's no change in the status quo. The only changes may be, say, for example, efficiency or savings in time or costs or something or another. But nevertheless, we're taking a risk-based approach based upon some risk assessment that we've performed. We may perform that risk assessment on materials. We may be thinking about possible contamination. We may be thinking about supply issues. Whatever it is that we're thinking about, we will be making those a final decision based upon that particular risk assessment, and that final decision is our risk-based approach. For regulatory submissions, the authorities have already done a risk-based approach where they're looking at transferring risk to, for example, the marketing authorization holder. So, for example, for type 1A variations to the terms of a marketing authorization, the marketing authorization is ultimately responsible for quality, safety, efficacy. They're ultimately responsible for the care, the well-being and the public health, with regards to their medicinal products. But certain kinds of changes, like administrative changes or changes where we are actually reducing the risk, i.e., we're improving our potential for quality, higher quality material, those changes, they have the regulators and the regulatory authorities and competent authorities or the agency have decided that's the responsibility of the marketing authorization holders. They can make those changes, they can implement those changes, and they can just simply tell us. And that's a do and tell, a type 1A. And a type 1B, the risk associated with those kinds of changes is higher, and therefore they want to be informed first. They want to give their approval before we can implement the changes. And type 2s, it's the same thing. It's a major change, and therefore they want to be informed about it. They want to be able to give their approval before we can make those changes. That whole approach is a risk-based approach. It's risk-based in terms of the work is going to be shared between the authorities and the competent and the marketing authorization holders, and that the decisions or the reasons and justifications is based upon the risk to the public and the type of changes that the marketing authorization holders want to make. Another example is when we change suppliers. So, for example, if we're changing suppliers of our materials, there's a risk associated with that. There's a risk that the supplier that you take on, the new supplier, may not be necessarily as good as the previous one, and in terms of the quality of the material that they're supplying us with. And therefore, we have to perform a risk assessment. And that risk assessment may be to ensure that the supplier is qualified, and we perform certain qualification activities. And this is making an assessment of the risk associated with that supplier, and therefore we take a risk-based approach. And then with regards to clinical trials, again, the authorities have done a risk assessment, and they've done a risk assessment based upon the type of clinical trial that we are, or that they are going to be monitoring, or that they're going to be actively involved in. Non-interventional clinical trials, they're not going to be involved in them. They don't want to know what's going on. It's interesting and important information, and they may capture that information as part of their pharmacovigilance assessments, if you like. But they're not really interested in controlling, in approving such clinical trials, because there's no intervention. They're more interested in interventional clinical trials where the risk is high, and low interventional clinical trials, they've given us criteria that has to be met in order for that to be classified as a low interventional clinical trial. And so therefore they're taking a risk-based approach with regards to how they control and manage, and how they assess and approve clinical trials. So it's based upon doing a risk analysis, determining what type of a trial it is, and therefore determining whether or not they should have oversight and approval of those trials. So we're already, to a degree, in the pharmaceutical industry, we're already making decisions and performing risk assessments. But a risk-based approach, as I said, is different to a risk assessment. A risk assessment is where we haven't yet identified the risk or the hazard, and what we're doing is we're proactively looking to prevent harm, hazard, defects, or failures, or anything else. Failures or death, or harm, death or anything that's life altering or life changing. We're looking to identify them proactively because it hasn't yet occurred, and we want to prevent that from happening. And the ICH Q9, it provides a framework, a guidance document for pharmaceutical companies to integrate into their pharmaceutical quality systems, so that it enables them and encourages them to proactively identify and manage risks associated with their products and their processes. Right, so this guideline document is applicable to not just the pharmaceutical industry, but it's also applicable to the competent authorities, because they use this where they do risk assessments. Like, for example, they might do a risk assessment with regards to how they're going to inspect a site. Do you know what I mean? So it's not just applicable to pharmaceutical industry, but it's also applicable to the regulators themselves. And it's important that well, actually, let's just talk about the quality risk management, what it is as defined in the ICH guidelines. And so it is: quality risk management is a systematic process for the assessment, control, communication, and review of risks to the quality of the drug product, the medicinal product, across the product life cycle. And yeah, it's important. It's really important that that process is science based and, if possible, data driven, and that it's not dependent or based upon somebody's intuition or experience, even though that person may have very good intuition and very good experience. It should be science based, and it should be, if possible, data driven. And when you do that, you can then improve decision makings and make scientific and data driven decisions, and reduce subjectivity. It needs to be more objective. And in the industry, as I said, it represents a proactive approach to identify and mitigate risks. And ultimately, that leads to the protection of patients. And again, then this is most importantly, performing risk assessments and using this risk management process doesn't obviate the industry's obligation to comply with regulatory requirements. If you have identified a risk or some kind of a hazard, and we'll go through what a risk and a hazard is in a later slide, and you have to take measures to control those risks, those measures may require you to make a submission to the regulatory authorities. You may have to make a submission via doing some kind of substantial modification, some kind of a variation or submission to the regulators, in order to advise them of the change and advise them as to why you've made those changes. So it doesn't obviate you from doing so. But those risk assessments should be, as I stated, scientific, data driven, and I guess you will need some kind of risk ranking tool, and they use that in project management to prioritize risk and better utilize your resource. But this enables us to build in quality into your systems. When you have this approach, that's what you do. You build in quality into your systems before failures actually occur. And also this risk management process, as I'm going to go through, it improves transparency. It builds trust between the regulatory authorities and the marketing authorization holder or the sponsor. And the benefits can be applied throughout the whole of the product life cycle. And I will talk about that in a later slide. So where does all these risk assessment occur? And where is it applied to? At what stages in the product life cycle does it occur? And it occurs in all of the product life cycle. And I've put here development, I've put here manufacturing, I've put here distribution. It's also like in terms of administrating the drug, in terms of ensuring that there are sufficient supplies of the drug to the patient in the regions and the countries and member states where it is applicable to, that marketing authorization or that clinical trial is applicable to. So it applies to all of the stages in the product life cycle, and it's basically about integrating quality risk management during, as I say, in the whole of the product life cycle. So it's applicable to drug substance, drug product, biological and biotechnological medicinal products, and it will hopefully foster continuous improvement where you are, well, it may lead to updating regulatory documentation, and the objective is where the applicants, particularly for approved medicinal products, they have to reflect exactly what they are doing and do exactly what they're stating for the manufacture of this medicinal product in the marketplace. And this is what we refer to when we talk about regulatory compliance. So this is applicable to raw materials, it's applicable to solvents, excipients, packaging, labeling, and the supply network. It's applicable to the whole of the life cycle. And as I say, it's your regulatory documentation has to reflect exactly what we do, and we, the manufacturers and the marketing authorization holders, have to do exactly what we state in terms of our dossiers for the marketplace, and therefore we have to comply with our regulatory legislation. Right, I just want to circle back and take things back to first principles, because I've been talking about risk, and I think we really need to define what risk is. So, risk is different to an issue. An issue is something that has already occurred or is occurring right now, whereas a risk is something that hasn't yet occurred. So, a risk is a combination of the probability of an occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. That's what risk is. So a hazard, and when we talk about hazard, this is how we identify what the risk is. We identify what the risk is itself, and that's the hazard. Is anything that has the potential to harm patients, product quality, or the business in terms of the loss of batches of medicinal products, the interruption to the supply of the drug product, or the damage to reputation of the industry or of the actual drug. Because, for example, we want to ensure that people take drugs, and if people believe that there's something wrong with the drugs, then they might not want to take those drugs, and then that could ultimately end up leading to harm of the patient. So reputation is really important. And this is how when we're performing our risk analysis, we will identify the hazard, and we will look at the probability, and we can look at the probability in terms of numerical ways, numerical values, or we can look at probability in terms of categorical values, and multiply that by the severity. What's the severity? How dangerous? What was the, I don't know, the rank in terms of the harm that was caused? And this is what we do when we look at when we perform a risk analysis. So that's taking things back to first principles. So in quality, what we could think about hazards in terms of three main categories, if you like. So we can think about the potential threat, system defects, and failures. And potential threats are, for example, certain kinds of chemical reactions, manufacturing issues. These are potential threats. They haven't yet occurred. Or problems and issues with regards to facilities and equipment. And I think I've already touched upon that with regards to contamination, or if I haven't, I will do. And then system defects, where things are not haven't yet occurred, but the potential to occur. So, for example, something that may not be detected something that is insufficiently prevented from happening, or something that emerges by degrees. This is how we classify a system defect. And the failures are things like technical breakdown, human breakdown, or some kind of extrinsic effect. So these are the three sorts of categories of hazards in quality. So in terms of the guidelines, and anything that I've put in bold italics, I've taken straight out of the ICHQ 9 for your information. We talk about the principles of quality risk management are twofold. The first part is the evaluation of risk to quality should be based on scientific knowledge, and ultimately linked to the protection of patients. And this also includes product availability, as I've explained in the previous slide. It's important when you're making an evaluation of risk to get all of the subject matter experts and stakeholders together with this objective. So that's really important, because if you're evaluating risk and you haven't taken into consideration a subject matter expert, say for example with a microbiological background, then you're missing a very integral and important part of the risk itself. So it's really important when you are evaluating risk to get together all of the subject matter experts and all of the stakeholders, i.e. the people who are immediately affected by or interested in the assessment, to get them together when you're defining this, or when you're evaluating a risk. And the level of effort, formality, and documentation of the quality risk management process should be commensurate with the level of risk. So what that means is things that are high risk need a lot of effort, a lot of formality, a lot of documentation, a lot of formality with regards to the senior management in terms of the the assessment and the evaluation and the approval of the risk control measures, the documentation of the risk. All of these things have to be commensurate with the level of risk. Something that's low risk and not really requiring a lot of input will not require a high level of formality, and the documentation may be, commensurate, as in less documentation. But it does involve you having to do some kind of initial risk assessment, to rank the risk itself. So to rank all of the risks associated with what your teams may be looking at in order to determine and prioritize the risk. And if when you do your risk assessments, you need to document the outcomes, even if it's considered to be a low level risk. Therefore, you need to have, good quality systems in place to make sure that this happens, and to ensure that the relevant stakeholders and subject matter experts are informed and the agreement obtained if necessary. Right, so I just want to simplify the risk management process, because it really, in my mind, consists of 4 stages. This I think is a very good way of describing it. The first step is a risk assessment step, and the risk assessment consists of various activities which we'll go into, but that's the first stage. The next stage is risk control, where we will be looking at managing the risk or eliminating the risk, or whatever. Again, that consists of other steps within that particular process. And then communication. Now, communication can occur at the start of the risk assessment, during the risk assessment, after the risk assessment, as determined by the level of the risk, or the degree, or the severity of the risk. So the communication is part of, and should be part of, your risk management process. And then risk review. Now, risk review is where you have looked at the risk, you've put in some control measures, you've closed it out per se, but you're going to come back and look at this particular thing in a few months' time, say, or a few weeks' time, or a few days' time, I don't know, depending upon the risk. So you have to have a loop, if you like, where you review the whole thing to ensure that you are managing this risk as it has been identified, or you are controlling the risk, or it's adequate for your systems. So this is kind of how I see it. It consists of 4 stages in my mind, or at least 3 stages, but one stage that is applicable to all, where you have your risk assessment, your risk control, you communication, and your risk review. And I'll be describing this in more steps, or in later slides, but your risk assessment will involve you using risk management tools, and these will include things like flow charts and flow maps, fishbone diagrams, Ishikawa diagrams, and fault tree analysis, and many other risk management tools. And your communication, this is your output, and all the relevant stakeholders, as I say, need to understand and be communicated and informed, and therefore it needs to really kind of be part of your process, where you, or your systems, where you have an automatic, if you like, process where all of the relevant people are informed, and that can be your change management or your change control. And then your risk review will be your process for monitoring the changes that have been put in place, and you may want to analyze the data that you collect and confirm that the implementations were acceptable. So this is the risk assessment, and the first stage of the risk assessment is your identification of your hazard. Now, the ICHQ9 goes into detail here, and I really don't want to spend too much time, but it's just basically what might go wrong. So this is your hazard identification. And then you look at what is the likelihood or the probability that it will go wrong, and this is your risk analysis. And what are the consequences or the severity that will occur if this thing happens. And then your risk analysis will be like a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the actual risk. And then your risk evaluation, and that will be where you are comparing your risk analysis data to some kind of a predefined criteria. So some criteria that was already predefined, and it could be categorical in nature, or it could be numerical in nature, and it's already been predefined, and you've done your analysis, and now you're comparing your risk analysis to your criteria, and you're doing a risk evaluation. And from that risk evaluation, you can then put into place control measures. It becomes easier to, once you've identified the risk, once you've analyzed the risk and looked at the occurrence and the severity and a whole host of other things, you can then do an evaluation where you compare it against some predefined and pre-specified criteria in order to take the correct measures and control the risk. It becomes easier to do that. So here is the risk control step. Now, I think I've added a few more boxes compared to the ICH guidelines. However, the ICH guidelines is a framework, and it's not exhaustive list of control measures or approaches. And there may be more, or it may be that I've just simply interpreted this as something separate. But risk control can consist of risk reduction, risk acceptance, risk elimination, or risk transfer. So risk reduction could be mitigation actions. What do you take to mitigate, to prevent that from happening in the first place? So you haven't reduced the the risk, but you've taken approaches to so you haven't eliminated the risk, but you've taken approaches to mitigate the risk, to reduce the risk, or to avoid the risk. This risk is still there, but you're avoiding, you're taking alternative approaches. Risk acceptance. Now, this is something that has to be, in my opinion, agreed with the relevant stakeholders and subject matter experts, but it's an agreement to accept a specified or a detectable level of risk. It may very well be that this particular risk or hazard that you've identified is something that could potentially be high if it occurred, but it is something that can be detected. And therefore, because it is detectable, you can then accept the risk. And if you detect that risk, take appropriate actions. So this is a form, if you like, of risk acceptance, where you're accepting the risk based upon its detectability, or you could be accepting the risk based upon the benefits. If we're not talking about manufacturing, we're not talking about pharmaceuticals, but we may be talking about some other form of risk, say for example where you are giving a patient a drug and there's a risk, a very high risk of adverse reactions, but the drug itself is used to treat a condition that perhaps will result in death, and so you accept the risk, and the patient will obviously accept the risk of the high drug reactions because they're avoiding something that is more serious, which is death. And then risk elimination. And this is what actions we can take to eliminate the risk. So, for example, if you are using raw materials and those raw materials are derived from human or animal sources, well, if you can replace them with synthetic materials that are equally as good as the materials derived from human or animal sources, then you eliminate the risk of viral contamination or microbial contamination. So that's an example of risk elimination. And risk transfer could be, say, for example, where you have agreements and clauses in those agreements. So, for example, if you have a third-party agreement with a supplier, that they have to ensure that they provide you with a certain quality and grade of material or raw materials. And if they make any changes to those supplies or those raw materials, they have to advise you of what those changes are, and you have the right to say, no, you can't work with them anymore. So this is an example of transferring the risk, where the risk is transferred to another party, and it could be through third-party agreements. Communication is really important. It's important to ensure that all stakeholders, and that can also include your regulators and the subject matter the subject matter experts, are informed. Ooh, I've got regulators twice. Well, that's very important. And also healthcare professionals and patients. No point in knowing that there's a problem and not informing the people who are directly affected by that problem, and that could be the patients or the healthcare professionals, in order to enable them to make informed decisions and informed choices. But also within the pharmaceutical industry, if it relates to, say, for example, the manufacture of a product, the medicinal product, you need to ensure that all the subject matter experts are informed, all the people who are affected are informed, because it may not be necessarily immediately obvious to the quality assurance or quality control department that a change is required. But if a regulatory professional may be aware of the fact that that requires a change, and therefore we have to make a submission to the regulatory authorities. And therefore, this sort of thing can be integrated into a company's change control or change management system, where we ensure that all the relevant stakeholders are informed. And this communication is really important for transparency, for building trust. And it also contributes to continuous improvement, because all of the people who are informed can bring into their perspectives, which may contribute to improvement rather than detract from it. And as I said, it's important for not just industry, this ICH guideline and this communication, but for the competent authorities as well. And Communication can occur at any stage of the process, um, and every stage at the process. I don't know what I wrote there. So, what is a risk review? So basically, a risk review is once you've implemented a change and once you've controlled the change, you want to be generating data. You don't just implement a change and then forget about it. You implement the change, you generate data looking at the criteria that you've identified to ensure that it's been met. And then at some point you want to perform some kind of a review. You may even as part of the risk review, do another risk analysis using risk management tools. So your risk review is actually a very important stage in your quality risk management process. It's a very important stage because it means that you don't just do the thing and forget about it. You do the thing, you collect data and you review those data at some point or at regular intervals, maybe during the process. And this is something that could be implemented in the normal reviews. For example, when we do product quality reviews, we may want to include the data from various studies in those product quality reviews. I've talked about periodic reviews. And I've also said that it may involve reanalysis of the data or reassessment of the risk. And there are many different formats that you can perform this review. You can perform it in meetings, or you can have meetings and you change control meetings, and you may want to consider regulatory requirements, if any. And there are various forms of review. These can be preliminary reports, final reports, and the circulation of these reports and commenting of these reports, the frequency, etc. All of this is dependent upon the level of risk. But you do need to ensure you may need to ensure, if it is a high degree of formality, that there's certain personnel within the structure that can sign off that they've read and understood and they accept the review. And also part of root cause analysis, I guess, is to learn from your mistakes, and project management, learning from your mistakes and sharing those learnings, because those learnings could be applied in another sector of the business. So this is the ICHQ9 quality risk management process in a diagram. So here you do your risk assessment, your risk control, you produce some kind of an output, and then you do your risk review. And you use risk management tools, which we're going to talk about, and you also ensure that you can communicate at all stages of that process. So you communicate to the relevant subject matter experts and the relevant stakeholders at all stages of that process. You can do a risk control and determine whether or not your risk control measures were acceptable or not. If they were acceptable, then you do another assessment and you accept the risk. If they're unacceptable, you then have to do a further risk assessment. Sorry, if they're acceptable, then you can then finalize it by doing your output, circulating it to the relevant management, and monitoring those control measures, and then at some point in the future performing a review. So it's a very nice diagram that shows the quality risk management process. So your risk assessment, as I said, you use your risk assessment tools. You select improvement opportunities. Your risk control, this can be a dedicated project. You may want to establish a team, and you want to think about your problem solving approach. And your risk review may involve data analysis. It may also involve the reapplication of risk assessment tools. Right, I just want to talk about the risk management methodologies. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them, because I am by no means an expert in every single one of them. I know I use some of them, but not all of them. And I've used some of them, but not all of them. But I just want to, for the sake of completion, talk about them. So the basic risk management tool is flowcharts and check sheets. Check sheets, I think, really can derive from flowcharts, but I think flowcharts are useful not just for the various methodologies that are available to be used. Failure mode effect analysis is a risk management tool, and that's useful for flowcharts are useful for identifying potential failures of, say, for example, equipment or facilities, and analyzing data that you can get from that. So you might identify where a failure can occur, look at the data associated to that particular area or that particular potential failure, and analyze that data. And I was going to say something about failure mode. Oh yes, you can look at historical data as well, and you can look to see where there were near misses and where things did actually go wrong. So failure mode effect analysis is a good tool, if you like, for looking at certain processes and systems. Failure mode effect and criticality analysis is something that I haven't done myself, and if you have done that, let me know and give me some ideas. I know the ICH guideline does talk about them, and I think it's really about finding out what is critical, the criticalities, and analyzing those. Fault tree analysis, again, this is another tool that's not just used in pharmaceuticals, but it's used in all other risk assessments, and it's just something that the pharmaceutical, it's a tool or a method of analyzing and understanding where faults could occur, and looking and drilling down into whether those faults are due to one thing or a combination of things. Hazard analysis and critical control points, I think, is something that's the philosophy is very, or the strategy is very familiar within the pharmaceutical industry, and I will go going through that in a moment. And hazard operability analysis, preliminary hazard analysis, again, is something that I think to a degree we already do when we're looking at manufacturing or designing manufacturing processes, or even for example, I've talked about obtaining a new supplier. We may do a preliminary hazard analysis where it's just looking at things from a top level perspective, but not drilling into things and looking for criteria. And then risk ranking and filtering are important for prioritizing risk and understanding which risks you want to address first. So these are risk management methodologies that are useful to be used in the pharmaceutical industry. And you can also use statistical tools in order to analyze and display and visualize the risks. Right, so this is something, I don't know whether or not it was actually something that was put in the ICH guidelines. I know it was in the previous guidelines, but this is the Ishikawa or the fishbone diagrams, and it's really to look at cause and effect. So you really want to understand what the causes are, or the potential causes are, for a particular a particular hazard. And it's a tool, it's a process where you have a problem statement, and you want to have that problem statement. It needs to be take into consideration a number of things. It may, for example, take into consideration the business case, take into consideration the goal, what the potential benefits are for looking at the or sorting out this particular issue or this particular risk, what the benefits are, what the goals are, and what the hazards are. And you may want to have a SMART goal. For example, it's going to be specific, it's going to be measurable, it's going to be something that is achievable, it's going to be something that's results. You get results, and time bound. So you might want to have a SMART goal, and these are the sorts of things that you'll be looking at, or you may be looking at. So you may be looking at the environment, people, materials, methods, measurement systems, and equipment. And what you want to be doing is you want to be asking questions, drilling down. So, for example, how does the environment impact on a particular risk? Asking questions from those questions. So you might, for example, say, that contamination may be a way that the environment can, or contamination, or for example, the release of toxic materials into the environment could be a potential. And then from there, you ask more questions. I think they call it the 5 whys, where you ask, why would that happen? And then you get an answer, and then you ask, why would that particular thing happen? And you drill down until you get to an answer, if you like. And that's your cause and effect. And you look at that, you look at those 6 criteria that I've listed there, and you can hopefully come up with a solution. So it's almost like a way of brainstorming and, getting to the root of a problem by using this particular tool. I talked about process maps, and I'm just going to give you a very simple example here as to why process maps are very useful, even when you're using those tools that I've described previously in the previous slides, because process maps have a way of visualizing the process, visualizing the system, even, or it can even be used for equipment, where you show how the piece of equipment works and where things can potentially go wrong. In this particular case, example, I'm just giving a very top level example of, say, for example, a manufacturing process, and where how we can perform a risk analysis. And this is not complicated or complex, because what I'm not trying to show off. I'm just trying to illustrate how process maps can be useful for identifying potential risks. So when you say, for example, you have your cells, you grow your cells, you purify your cells, and these cells are used to produce proteins, and the proteins are then purified further and then vialed up, and they've become the finished product. Yeah. So you can immediately see now where the potential hazards and risks are. So when you thaw cells, there's the potential for damage. Yeah. And so how you thaw your cells is something that you need to control, or you may need to control, because that's where you can cause damage. So the time for thawing, the conditions for thawing, the way that you thaw your cells, all of these things may impact on your viability, your cell viability, whether or not your cells are going to be viable, and therefore, that's a potential that you need to maybe control for, and you need to find ways of assessing and assigning criteria to ensure that you're going to get what you finally want. And then the other thing is cell growth. So after you've thawed your cells out, you're going to pass them through a number of cell passages, and then you're going to, or not cell passages, manufacturing stages, and then you're going to grow those cells and then divide those cells up, and then grow them and then divide them up, etc., because you want to get a lot of a high yield of cells. But you want to be controlling for heterogeneity. You want to ensure that you have a certain type of cells, and all of those cells are, to a large degree, homogeneous. You don't want a heterogeneous mix. You want homogeneous. You want the cells to be very similar to each other, because the proteins that those cells are going to produce are going to be dependent upon the quality of the cells. So you want to be controlling those cell growth. You want to strictly control the conditions, and you want to strictly control the rate and how many times you divide the cells up, and what you feed the cells, the conditions that in order to grow. And then you have to think about purification, and in terms of, you know, what are the hazards associated with that? What do you want to separate? You want to separate the cells from the media itself, or any other constituents that may be there, and you know, the potential for impurities in the final mixture, whatever it may be. So you want to be thinking about purification, and you want to be thinking about impurities that might be present and that you want to remove. And then again, those cells may be responsible for producing proteins, and the proteins may be the thing that you're interested in. So you want to ensure that your cells are producing the proteins of interest, and you know, heterogeneity is an issue there. You're also going to be purifying your proteins. I mean, this is really a top level, you know, it's a top level process map. It's not something that's showing what we really do, but I'm just trying to identify and use this, and to show that how you can use a process map to perform the activities that were discussed in the previous slides with regards to the risk methodologies, and that understanding the process and putting together a process map helps you to identify risks, and then you then vial your finished protein products in some kind of solution, and you know, you have to consider aseptic conditions. So this is, you can use preliminary hazard analysis. Yeah. So your preliminary, if you're just putting together a manufacturing process and you haven't got anything sorted out, you can perform a preliminary hazard analysis to look at where there are likely to be hazards. You can do your hazard analysis and critical control points, where you can look to identify the hazards and introduce, understand that this is a critical control point, and introduce criteria to control that particular point to ensure that you get a certain quality. It's also useful for looking at failure mode effect analysis, where we have where you can potentially have near misses, and as I said, historical failures and factors causing those failures. And it can be specific to facilities, or it can be specific to equipment. I've just put it for a particular manufacturing process. You know, in industry, manufacturing, we already use this. We already talk about critical process parameters and how we control those parameters. And this is a way, if you like, of identifying hazards, controlling for those hazards, and confirming the quality of those the final medicinal product. So I guess in terms of the final finished product, and this is something in this particular instance, you're always going to be thinking about contamination. You're always going to be thinking about extrinsic contamination, or intrinsic or intrinsic contamination. There's always going to be an issue, and particularly the worst type of contamination is microbial contamination, with regards to microbes, viruses and bacteria. So, hazard analysis and critical control points. What is that particular, and what is that? What does that consist of? So the ICH Q9 gives a much more scientific, if you like, description of this. And as I said, I think personally that drawing a process map allows you to be able to do this hazard analysis and critical control points, because it allows you to identify what the hazards are. And it allows you to then take the various steps that I've got there. But this tool this risk analysis tool was used mainly in food safety from a lot of my investigations. Not just, it's also written in the ICH guidelines, um, but because it's written in the guidelines, it can be applied to pharmaceuticals. So here you identify the hazard, you determine what the critical control points are, you set critical limits, so that could be limits or acceptance criteria. You monitor those critical control points. You may need to take corrective actions, verify the system, and keep records. Yeah, so this is basically what hazard analysis and critical control points is all about. Identifying the hazard means looking at the entire production process, maybe after you've defined your manufacturing process, or maybe before you've defined it. And critical control points are where your hazards can be controlled or eliminated. And setting critical limits, these are limits such as acceptance criteria, and then you can then monitor those critical control points. So this is hazard analysis, critical control points, a tool, a risk analysis tool that can help you to assess your risk, control your risk, and prevent potential failures or defects. Right, so all of these applications and all of these tools, where can they be applied and why are they applied? So they can be applied to and for continuous improvement. You want to be able to identify opportunities where you can, improve whatever process or whatever system you're applying this risk management tool to, or risk management process to. So your areas of use could be integrated into your quality management. It could be part of your regulatory operations. It could be part of development, your facilities, your equipment, your utilities, laboratories and stability studies. This is an important area that you can use quality risk management. Materials, your raw material management, packaging and labeling are areas where you can look at your quality risk management, because labelings are important. You want your labels to be able to stick, to be able to stay on the finished product for the duration of use of that finished product when it is being used in or administered by the patient or by a healthcare professional. So these are important sort of places where you can apply this quality risk management. You can also use it for deviation events, investigation reports. You can use it for complaints, issue management. And as I said, it should be integrated into your quality management systems. And also, it's also used by inspectors, and you can also use it for auditing, internal audits, but it's also used by inspectors or inspections, competent inspections, where regulators, they're planning to utilize their resource, i.e. their time, effectively. And so they're looking at the things that they want to assess. And the things that they may look at are things like quality defects that we've notified them of, recalls that we've notified them of, and CAPAs, what the corrective and preventative actions were. And they will also use these tools that they've defined here to, for example, look at the impact of the proposed variations or changes that were implemented following the defect or the recall. Right, so this slide, I got this slide for online, and it was something that somebody called Takayoshi Matsumura. I hope I could pronounce the name correctly. And I think it's interesting because it talks about, in my opinion, two things. It talks about continuous improvement, or whether or not you're going to need to redesign or re-engineer a product. So there's two different kind of processes. This is something that I recently was learning relating to Lean and Six Sigma. So when we're talking about continuous improvement, this is something that we want to work upon, and we want to implement things to improve. But where there's been a real failure, or there's a huge difference between what we want and what we are actually able to obtain, we may need to look at our design again and redesign or re-engineer some major thing. In both instances, there will be a regulatory submission of some sort. If you're looking at your design, you may very well be looking at redevelopment. So I think it's interesting in terms of looking at the customer requirements, looking at the customer satisfaction. I don't know whether or not I probably haven't interpreted this slide as it was originally discussed, but how quality risk management is, I would say, is integral to those three things: defining, designing, and manufacture. And where in each of those cases you may be required to make a regulatory submission. And he's talked about all the red arrows are part of the risk communication, where all the people who need to be informed are informed. I just thought it was an interesting slide. Right. I want to talk about emerging technologies, because risk assessment and risk mitigation may involve you thinking about using different approaches, and emerging technologies are useful for risk reduction, risk elimination, etc. So digitalization involves exploiting, technology in order to produce better medicinal products, maybe even better medical devices. Although that's not the scope of this discussion, although it can easily be applied. Medicinal products may be delivered using medical devices that exploit digital technologies. So, for example, patient-specific dosages, administering, medical devices, say for example, or medical devices that monitor patient vitals. All of these things are incorporating emerging technology and help to, there may be a certain amount of risk involved in that, but the overall objective is to improve the quality and to improve the patient's outcomes. And we may as well take advantage of them. Digitalization can be useful for the conduct of clinical trials. They can be useful for making data-driven decisions in terms of writing programs for that. And things like, for example, cloud computing and data integration, data warehouses, data mining, all of these things exploit digitalization, which can be useful for identifying risks that perhaps we would not be able to do using traditional methodologies. Artificial intelligence, as I've written there, this is machine learning. They're basically using algorithms that can analyze large data sets and predict trends that we may not necessarily be obvious to us, because we don't have those large data sets, or the human mind is not as good as a machine in analyzing those large data sets. And so the utilization of artificial intelligence can be very useful for those approaches and strategies. It can help with regards to risk reduction, because you can improve predictive analysis. You can make maintain and optimize your processes, reduce waste, and you can use more better controls over critical quality attributes and reduce human related errors and decision making, because machines are better at some things than humans are. There was a recent regulation, I can't remember, I think it was, well, certainly in 2024, I think it was either June 2024, sorry about that, that relating to artificial intelligence, and it was the Artificial Intelligence Act. And I believe that they do mention pharmaceuticals, but the use of pharmaceuticals with artificial intelligence and machine learning and the Artificial Intelligence Act currently is a high risk in terms of their categorization. I'll talk about that in a later slide. But artificial intelligence and machine learning are, we haven't yet got to the stage where we're doing some of these things, but they can be an important tool, particularly when we can write algorithms in order to analyze data sets and make predictions of potential hazards and harms that may not be immediately obvious to humans. Process analytical technologies, where we perform real-time monitoring of critical quality attributes during production. And this is useful in that it enables us to make immediate adjustments to the processes if necessary, if we can, and reduce batch failures. And when you reduce batch failures, you help with regards to the availability of the medicines and also to improve product quality. So this is something that's already implemented in some biological and biotechnological processes, because it is useful to have that real-time monitoring of critical quality attributes. Other technologies which I think are already employed anyway, but I'm still going to include them, is single-use technology. Now, this is really useful because it reduces or eliminates certain risks. So, for example, single-use technologies where you have disposable manufacturing components, you don't have the issues with cross-contamination. You don't have to have cleaning validation challenges and sterility issues, and it's just a very quick, maybe costly, but in terms of protecting the patient, and as more and more single-use technology products are employed, hopefully the cost will go down. But it's an important way of reducing the potential for hazards and harm in terms of contamination and cleaning, particularly for products where contamination is likely to be a major issue. Those would be sterile or aseptically manufactured products. Continuous manufacturing. So traditional batches are sort of where the start and the end of and that this is a batch. This is how we define a batch. But continuous manufacturing is where your traditional batch processes are replaced by a continuous production system, and it operates without interruption. And you can get reduced variabilities. There's some advantages and disadvantages with this. You can get reduce the variability between batches, maintaining steady state conditions. It's an approach that can be useful because of the fact that you minimize human errors. And I think that's mostly what we're talking about here, human errors, and where technology can be used to replace the human because of the fact that we have a high potential to make errors and mistakes. And then here I've got here blockchain for supply chain management. Now, this is something that I think has already been employed, in my opinion, because I think it's closely related to the falsified medicines directives. That's how I interpret this. So basically, you have a decentralized, secure system to track and verify the entire supply chain, and it increases transparency, it reduces the risk of counterfeiting, and ensures the authenticity and traceability of the medicinal product. So this, I think, is something that's already been captured in the falsified medicines directives. And the falsified medicines directive was introduced to prevent the introduction of counterfeit medicines into the EU system. I think the UK are no longer part of that. They're no longer part of the cross-border collaboration that occurs between the European Union or the European Economic Area. But I do believe some of the outcomes, if you like, or the directions or the goals of this directive has been implemented into the UK. So basically, what it consists of is anti-tampering devices and a verification system where medicines have to be verified at various points in the supply chain, especially before being dispensed to patients. And the Falsified Medicines Directive came into force in February 2019, and all prescription medicines in the European Union, they have to have certain those safety features, and they have to be able to be authenticated and tracked through that pan-European verification system. So they have certain key requirements, and one of them is this serialization, where you have this unique serial number that identifies the medicine. And I don't think the UK is doing that serialization, but they are doing the anti-tampering devices, and I don't think they're part of the verification system. So this serialization is one of the key requirements, anti-tampering devices another, and verification of the medicines before they're dispensed to the patient is a third. I think that this is where we are already employing these strategies, but I think it's important to mention them. Right, I just want to talk about very briefly the Artificial Intelligence Act. So this regulation, EU number 2024-1689, known as the Artificial Intelligence Act, it introduces rules, if you like, to regulate the use of artificial intelligence across the EU. Now, it's not specifically for pharmaceutical products, although I believe pharmaceutical products are mentioned there. I did scan it quickly, but it's really about how the industry regulates the use and development of artificial intelligence system across the European Union, and it's to ensure that AI systems are used safely, ethically, and transparently. But they also want to obviously encourage and foster innovation. And what I've got in this slide is I've got the categorization, how they categorize risk. So it's unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, or minimal risk. And these risks, it's basically a risk-based approach. And in terms of pharmaceutical products, I think this artificial intelligence where we're using algorithms to write programs to perform things is a computerized system approach, and there is a good manufacturing practice for medicinal products for human and veterinary use, Annex 11 for computerized systems, and this is I believe appropriate to follow this particular system. So I mean, artificial intelligence is new, at least new for me at least, and I think new in the industry. And so we're kind of still not yet at a stage where we can have definitive regulations for pharmaceutical products and how that's going to be integrated into current regulations. But, you need to ensure things like the AI has appropriate specifications, computer programming specifications. You need to audit your suppliers, and you need to audit your service providers. And this is something that we already do as it stands in good manufacturing practice. We need to test the product before implementation, and the use of sandboxes to test our AI systems is something. Process validation, again, is something that we would need to I think we already have guidelines for computer process validations and parallel testing or continuous assessment of AI systems. There may be special requirements with regards to recalling a system. I don't know, but I think it's important to mention it because we are moving into the era of machine learning and artificial intelligence. So, in conclusion, quality risk management is a proactive strategic approach, and it's a system that should be implemented into pharmaceutical quality systems. What have I got? Yeah, it should be integrated into your pharmaceutical quality systems. Any changes that you identify you should make that consideration or that assessment to determine whether or not it needs to be communicated to the regulatory authorities. The regulatory authorities, they also apply these quality risk management to their projects and to their processes, particularly for inspections. And a risk-based approach, coming and circling back, is an approach that has been decided upon based upon some kind of risk assessment. And I think that's it. I've got some resource there. I hope you find that useful with regards to the Artificial Intelligence Act Explorer, a compliance checker, and what the ICH guidelines state, and the links to those guidelines, and a link to the guideline for the pharmaceutical quality systems. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. If you have, please consider giving me a like and please consider subscribing. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye bye.